A long time ago, I talked about the bell curve in gaming. What is it? It's a way of showing normal distribution in statistics, often attributed to IQ, where there's a small amount of people with a very low IQ, a large amount of people with a normal IQ, and then a small amount again of people with exceptionally high IQ levels. Many of them subscribe to this channel. This bell curve phenomenon can be applied to many things on the X and Y axis, and when used outside of IQ, it's often a way of displaying an idea about the populace at large, and to signify a tipping point. With gaming, you can attribute that X-axis as either money or popularity, since the more popular a thing becomes, the more money tends to be involved anyway, and you can have a Y-axis be that intangible, subjective quality of the gaming world in a more generalized sense. By the very virtue of subscribing to this channel, most of you already display a tacit understanding of what I'm talking about in this video. You wouldn't be sat watching DOS videos and reminiscing about better times if you didn't. We peaked, and a lot of people don't like to admit that we peaked. They change the parameters and claim otherwise, or make fun of people reminiscing about the past and claim it's all just nostalgia. You know it isn't nostalgia, so we can dispense with that claim immediately. A great company to look at when I'm talking about the phenomenon is BioWare, as their games span that period between the glory days and the current times nicely, and they operated for the most part within a very specialist niche. In 1998, they released their third game, Baldur's Gate, and introduced the world to the Infinity Engine, an RPG engine that allowed real-time with pause combat to blend seamlessly with standard non-combat gaming. It was critically acclaimed as the best RPG ever released, and they followed it up with Baldur's Gate 2, which was, and still is, considered superior, continuing the story and eventually concluding with the massive Throne of Baal expansion. All three titles were universally lauded, and followed up by a switch to the Aurora engine, a move into 3D, and more acclaim for Neverwinter Nights, but not quite the same praise as before. Then a year later, Knights of the Old Republic happened, a permanent switch to third person, full voice acting outside of the protagonist, and a more cinematic approach that signaled the end of BioWare as a traditional CRPG developer. This solidified their formula for the next decade, but there were inherent drawbacks to switching. Moving from the overhead 2D to 3D everything meant that the levels were smaller, the voice acting required that the dialogue be shortened. The combat gradually devolved from tactical dice rolling to a more action-focused style. This was established by the button-mashing martial arts of Oriental RPG Jade Empire, which was essentially Kung Fu KOTOR. Then came Mass Effect, which was KOTOR meets Star Control meets generic third-person shooter. Gone were the dialogue options, replaced with a conversation wheel. Gone were the original engines, replaced by Unreal. The combat was still tactical to a degree, but nowhere near the amount of the previous games, and with poor AI, and didn't feel as well integrated into the game. But its setting and tone made it a mega hit. The company had successfully transitioned from an RPG developer into an action RPG developer. There's a big difference. They captured the concurrent development of the gaming industry from niche hobbyist marketplace into giant mega corporation land, with each release having more of a cinematic and polished feel to it than the last. And let's not forget their homage to games they used to make in Dragon Age Origins, which was essentially Fantasy Mass Effect meets Baldur's Gate in BioWare's own upgraded Eclipse engine, but without the Dungeons & Dragons IP. Depending on who you ask, any of these games could be considered where BioWare peaked. Was it their turn of the millennium with Baldur's Gate 2? Was it their cinematic transition into third-person KOTOR? Was it the original space opera IP that the first two Mass Effect games represent? Was it Dragon Age Origins? All of these games are considered some of the finest ever made. And that's where our bell curve comes in, because eventually BioWare reached critical mass, and that would have an effect. Everything they released from 2010 onward was met with questions. Why was the DLC policy so obnoxious? Why did you ruin the combat of Dragon Age by making it an action RPG too? Why did you botch the storyline on Mass Effect by getting rid of a head writer? Why did you make the sequel to the Knights of the Old Republic series an MMO? Why did you cancel 3 of your upcoming games? Why was Inquisition an open world Skyrim like with MMO leftovers? Gone were the company that would release a game every year or every other year, replaced with longer and longer wait times between titles, and each of them responded to with incredulity by the gaming public. It's now been 4 years since their last game, Anthem, and the company is a shell of what it once was, and a perfect representation of what has happened to the gaming industry as so many of the big players who helped shape it suffered the exact same fate around the exact same time. It varies wildly depending on who you ask, because opinions on when gaming was at its best are subjective. After all, Souls-like fans are living in a golden age. Good for them. But generally speaking, the games of the past did it better than the games of today.
Stop!
And there are roughly 3 camps of people who specify when the peak of that bell curve for them was. Some will say it was the early to mid-90s, others will claim that the turn of the millennium was when things peaked, others will say that after the likes of GTA 5 and Skyrim, gaming just stagnated. But I suspect that latter date was more when the symptoms became undeniable to most. Any way you slice it, we're in decline. And for me personally, there are 3 very prominent genres from the turn of the millennium that I'm very frustrated about because they're the perfect example. So I'm gonna rant about that now to conclude the video. Where's the next Knights of the Old Republic? Is the best we can really muster some AA janky spiders release? Threads abound on the internet asking for games like it, only to be met with a series of CRPG recommendations completely missing the point. Where's the next great plot-focused RTS? Why are the best games on Steam from that genre remasters of titles from the 90s or early 2000s? Did everyone just give up after StarCraft 2 was released? And the plot-focused space combat simulators? Why are the 2 best games in the genre fan remasters of games from the 90s? Why did I have to spend hundreds of hours of my life alpha testing a modification of an official release from 20 plus years prior in order to have TIE Fighter in widescreen? Why is that still better than the best the genre can muster now? You know the reason why. I know the reason why. Perhaps some people viewing this video will now know the reason why. Gaming peaked, and a lot of people are starting to realize that it did so during or shortly after the DOS era that launched it to new heights.